Now I would like to present our speaker for today, Ms. Nancy Sheppard.
Thank you, Bob, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me okay over there? Cool. All right, as Bob said, my name is Nancy Sheppard. I am from right here in Yorktown, originally, though, from Virginia Beach, so I'm a transplant. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit of some of the darker aspects of our local history for, well, everywhere in the Tidewater area. And that's my book, so shameless plug number 1. So kind of to talk about a little bit of the etymology I'll be using today, as all of us are from the area know, Tidewater and Hampton Roads, though some prefer one to the other, are kind of interchangeable terms, so I'm referring to the same place. It basically is anywhere that encompasses northeastern North Carolina up through Williamsburg, James City County. So we sit up right here in the north of the area. And like every area, right here in the Tidewater has a very vibrant history. We're known for our beautiful beaches, our wonderful tourism attractions, our great military bases, and of course, our great people. But there is a darker side to every region, and ours is no exception. We've had things happen, like a massacre at a Spanish mission that existed just south of Jamestown in 1540. We had Blackbeard, whose head was put on a pike in Hampton, and his men were hung in Williamsburg in 1718. Skipping ahead a little, we had the burning of Hampton in 1861. And in Virginia Beach in 1929, the founder of the Coors Brewery, Adolph Coors, mysteriously fell from the 6th floor window. Some say it was suicide. Some say there was something else that may have happened. Apparently, he was a very unlikable person, so we can only guess. Then we had a test pilot out of Langley Field who suffered a traumatic brain injury while testing a plane out in the James River. In 1961, he was captaining a boat with a family on board, not his, but a family on board, and he ended up murdering every single one of them except for one little girl who revealed his truth. The picture you see here is just after he committed suicide, right after he was discovered by the U.S. Coast Guard. And then, of course, in 1992, we always have to end these topics with some humorous notes, when 2 shock jocks decided to tell the entire area that Mount Trashmore in Virginia Beach was going to explode in kind of a War of the Worlds type of situation. Of course, that led to a little bit of mayhem in the area and a little bit of a humorous footnote of our own history. But today we're going to focus on 4 particular stories. Now, there are 3 women, 1 couple that's very famous that are involved in these. In 1607, Jamestown was founded as the first permanent English settlement here in the New World. And it was promised to be this Edenic paradise of gold and food and drinkable water, but what they found was the furthest thing from. And that's where our stories begin today. Now, this young woman whose face that we're looking at is what we guess this 14-year-old girl named Jane looked like. She was Jane of Jamestown. Now, forensics showed, again, she was about 14 years old. And when she arrived in the New World in Jamestown in about August 1610 on a small ship. She had a healthy diet for most of her life, probably came from the southern part of England. We don't know if she was the daughter of a more noble person or if she was a servant that was beloved by her family that came over. But what we do know is the story that she was meant to tell us and meant to confirm to us. And through her broken bones and hollowed eyes of her skull, she had so much to tell us, not just about where she came from, but where we came from here in Virginia. Now, again, Jamestown was founded on May 13, 1607, by the Joint Stock Company, the Virginia Company of London. Captain Christopher Newport sailed from England with 104 men on board the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery. But only a handful of these new colonists were prepared for this hard, laborious lifestyle. And there was no readable source of drinkable water. In fact, what's an interesting note is that the water around there was a natural aquifer for arsenic. And during this time, we were in the midst of an unprecedented drought. So you combine the summer humidity and heat of southeastern Virginia with this natural aquifer for arsenic, and it was lethal. Now, the 7-man governing body of the colony was very disconnected from the common man, not like we know anything about that today. And the colony suffered again from this unprecedented drought that affected not only the colonists that arrived, but the Powhatan, and they were struggling to just grow their crops. Now, by the end of the first 8 months of the colony, only 38 of those 104 men that arrived survived. Now, this was also due to disease, that mysterious situation where someone would just develop horrible lesions and things that are akin to arsenic poisoning. And, of course, there was famine. Now, the native people were not very keen on the new arrivals. They had a very bad interaction with the Spanish in the late 16th century. Again, there was a massacre. But they helped where they could. But then we had the strong-armed tactics of people like Captain John Smith, who kind of rubbed them the wrong way. To add to this perfect storm of situations, we had the colony that was founded as a money-making venture, not necessarily as a survivability venture. So back home in England, where they were even more disconnected from what was going on back here, they weren't exactly sending the supplies or the men or tools that were needed. You had men who were using nets without a net in them to try to catch fish or trying to hit them with pans because they didn't really know how to fish. And they also didn't really have the food stores. Now, the colony was quickly running out of supplies throughout this early period, and the leaders attempted to split it in order to garner more support for the home colony in Jamestown. And they sent various people to the native tribes around the area to hopefully get some help. Now, the relations, again, with the native people disintegrated, and from a tentative hostility to an outright undeclared war. Now, there was a resupply fleet that was set from England in 1609, but they encountered a storm that sent the main ship off course into the Caribbean. And as a side note, this story of the ship helped inspire the Shakespeare play, The Tempest. So in August, a much smaller vessel filled with even more colonists, including women and children, and probably Jane, arrived, but they had no usable supplies. They had no way to absorb these new colonists into Jamestown, and they had to camp in a 7-acre cornfield upon their arrival. And they ate through all of the corn, their food, within 3 days. By the end of this summer, tensions with the native people reached an apex, and the colonists were forced inside the palisade walls of the fort. Now, the native Powhatan again forced them inside these barren palisade walls, and there was no food. If they dared venture outside the wall, they were surely to get killed. They slaughtered their horses, then dogs, cats. They ate shoe leather, roots, tree bark, anything they could. And when they had none of that left, they turned to the only available sustenance they could find, each other. George Percy wrote of a time where a man was caught with salted pieces of his missing pregnant wife around his hovel. This man claimed that his wife died of natural causes, but George Percy wanted to make an example that killing someone for food was not acceptable, and the man was publicly burned alive. However, a blind eye was turned towards eating the dead. George Percy described having his gaunt, surviving neighbors digging up dead bodies and leaving behind civility in the name of survival. The difference between what we're talking about today, survival cannibalism, is they were doing this for means of survival. They were not doing it like what we would think of as common cannibalism for some sort of ritualistic manner. Now, this is about the time that Jane died, was this winter of 1609. We don't know how she died. All we know is that she did. Not long after she passed away, she was butchered by 2 different people, one more skilled than the other. And what was left of her was thrown into a refuse pit and left to be discovered in 2012. And this is actually her skull that you see up there. Of the 300 colonists forced into the fort at the beginning of the winter, only 60 survived to spring. They attempted to abandon the colony, but Lord Delaware found them en route home and forced them back to clean up and, quote, make it work. Between 1607 and 1622, 4,800 of the 6,000 colonists that came to Jamestown died for whatever reason. They faced immeasurable odds at an unknown place and attempting to assert their culture on an already thriving one. And they attempted to survive when every amount of odds were against them. Now today we have iron crosses that stand everywhere archaeologists have found human remains around the Jamestown fort. At the bottom of a refuse pit at a home sat a grisly discovery, waiting to confirm what many historians argued they thought didn't happen. But staring back at them were the hollowed eyes of the skull of this young girl and a piece of her shin bone. And while we may never know who she was, the girl who endured this incomprehensible situation and had a post-mortem legacy that would teach us so much more. Now we're going to fast forward a little bit to the heroine of my hometown, Virginia Beach, Grace Sherwood, the Witch of Pungo, 1706. Now, Virginia's history with witchcraft is not nearly as colorful or dramatic as our brethren to the north. We had a different type of culture here. Up there, they were a little bit more religious-based. While down here, we were a lot less superstitious. We tried to separate as best you could for the 17th, 18th century religion from practical means. So again, it wasn't quite as dramatic or romantic, if you want to say that. And we tended to be a little bit more pragmatic and intellectual, if that can exist, when it came to witchcraft. And courts in Virginia were secular as opposed to the ones up north. And we enforced stiff punishments for any false accusations of witchcraft. Now, laws regarding witchcraft in the Virginia colony were drawn from various pamphlets and guides that came over from England. And these detailed behavior and possessions of what would instigate someone being a true witch. Now, as well as these certain possessions that we'll talk about in a minute, there are physical identifiers called witches' marks or witches' teats, which were basically skin tags or moles. And they thought, yep, that showed that she was consorting with the devil. Now, women and sometimes men that were accused were usually those who stayed outside of societal expectations and norms. Now, this included adhering to certain gender roles, like wearing pants. Had something that another wanted to gain, or proved that there was some sort of threat or jealousy. For instance, a very beautiful woman was more likely to be called a witch by a man's wife. So, we're going to move to the very first witch trial, which was Joan Wright of Kecoughtan. And she was, again, the first known case of a witchcraft trial here in Virginia. And she lived in Isle of Wight County at the time of her trial, and she was a skilled midwife. In 1626, she was accused of causing the death of a neighbor's infant, while also accurately predicting the deaths of 2 local men. Now, through a 21st century lens, this kind of seems absurd. Again, this is during a time of unprecedented drought. And so it would have been understandable, given her profession as a midwife, that she could see the evidence of someone getting ready to die. And for a time when infant mortality rates were extremely high, it would make sense she might be able to pick this out. But interesting enough, she was also accused of some other rather heinous crimes, like forcing another neighbor to dance naked in front of a tree. And she had to make another one who was unable to hunt animals. Now, it wasn't her fault that one of her neighbor had some strange exhibitions, and the other one had a terrible shot. But in the end, that made her accused of being a witch. She defended herself vigorously in court, and this is a time women didn't do things like this. And she actually won her case. Now, there are only a handful of witchcraft accusations that went to trial here in Commonwealth Virginia, unlike Massachusetts probably had more in one season than we had the entire period. And then no one was ever executed here for witchcraft. Now, there was one man who was banished, Another one that was sentenced to lashings and other things like jail time. But it wasn't, again, as romantic. And now I'm going to introduce you to Grace Sherwood. Now, Grace was born in the rural Pungo section of Virginia Beach. If you're not familiar with our geography down there, it's the very rural section that basically is the neighbor to northeastern North Carolina. And she was born there in 1660. She was the daughter of John White, who was a landowner, and he was considered educated for the day. They did not own any slaves. They worked their land themselves. And they were members in good standing with the Lynnhaven Parish, which is something you definitely want it to be at that time. Now, Grace is said to have been independent, beautiful, extremely outspoken, and intelligent, some of the things that the people of the parish didn't want a woman to be. In 1680, she married James Sherwood, and he was considered uneducated, and by the records, he was definitely not skilled or a landowner. So she was marrying below her class, which made her an automatic pariah for the society. And it drew the ire of the members of her parish. Now, when her father died, he left most of his property, except for, I believe, 1 acre and a gun, I think, to his son-in-law, which, again, this, he had a woman no one liked, a large plot of land. She was going to be a target for everything. Now, she helped work around the farm, often wearing men's trousers, heaven forbid. And she was considered a skilled healer, and she was often seen wearing these trousers going through the different fields, picking herbs and anything else that was considered medicinal. And she was also a midwife. They had 3 sons together. Now, throughout her marriage, she was, again, the target of rumors, accusations, and even lawsuits from her neighbors. And given the amount of land she owed and how she deviated from the strict expectations of women for the time, it was understandable, looking at it in the past, why she was targeted. Now, when James Sherwood died in 1701, he did not leave a will. Again, he was considered uneducated. His signature consisted of just an X. The land reverted back to the crown, but Grace was able to remain on it and work it and basically keep it all but in name only. And that's because she was a woman and not allowed. She refused to remarry, which is also something that was odd for society at that time, and because women could not necessarily have legal, monetary, or societal benefits without having a husband represent her. Now, Grace was accused of witchcraft by a couple that she lobbied legal disputes, including defamation, for several years. The husband accused Grace of witchcraft and appealed to the higher court in Williamsburg. Now, the higher court in Williamsburg said, you know what, this is a little bit outside of our jurisdiction. Let's volley it back down to the Lynnhaven Parish, and that they did. She was inspected by a jury of women after taking from her home and walked to the jail, the local jail. Now, some of these women she didn't have a good relationship with. In fact, one of them she had a legal dispute with several years before. And when they reported back after inspecting her body, they said that her body was unlike theirs, meaning she had these witches' marks. Now, the court could not definitely decide whether or not she was a witch just based on this and this type of evidence that was brought before them, if you could call it that. And they decided their only course of action was to do a trial by witch ducking. If you've been to Virginia Beach, you may have been down Witch Duck Road. Now, custom was to duck a woman that was accused in consecrated water to see whether or not she was evil. If she sank to the bottom and drowned, she wasn't evil, she wasn't a witch, but she could be buried in a churchyard. But if she rose to the top, it was the consecrated water trying to expel the evil from it. Of course, the judges were like, okay, we're not going to let her drown necessarily, but let's see what happens. So on July 10th, 1706, they took her out to a place in Virginia Beach called Witch Duck Point. And again, their intention wasn't actually to let her drown, but just to see what happened. So they tied her right thumb to her left big toe and vice versa and threw her over the boat. Everyone waited. And then they saw her pop up to the top. It was very unusual for this time for people to know how to swim, so they only assumed the water was trying to expel her. They once again tried to throw her over, and she rose to the top. What they failed to take into account is where she lived in Punko was right on the water, so for where she lived and grew up, it wasn't unusual for her to know how to swim. And anyway, if it was between drowning and being buried in a courtyard, in a churchyard, or living and being thrown into jail, she picked to live. Now, she was subsequently put on trial in Williamsburg, and unfortunately, those records have been lost to the ages. And then she languished in jail until her release in 1714. Now, after her release, Grace was able to return to her farm and successfully petitioned very unpopular Governor Alexander Spotswood for ownership of her family's land. In exchange for 2 pounds of tobacco per acre, which was a great amount, Grace was granted the land patent and was deeded to her and her posterity forever. As of 1731, she was the only one of 5 female landowners in Virginia and the only one designated a widow. She died in 1740, and while there are suspicions, it is unknown where she's buried. Now, in 2006, on the 300th anniversary of her ducking, Governor Tim Kaine came to Virginia Beach and formally exonerated Grace, legally restoring her name. Little too late, but it was enough. In Virginia Beach, we have Witch Duck Point, Witch Duck Road. We have Gracetown, all named in honor of her because we recognize that she left a legacy as a strong female role model who refused to adhere to what society and patriarchal norms told her she should be. She paid a price for that, but left, again, this legacy for not only Virginians, for not just women, but for people everywhere to kind of stay in your own lane. Don't be what everyone tells you you should be, because it's okay to be different. We're going to skip ahead a little bit, because not much happened here in the 19th century. I'm joking, of course. And we're going to talk about the trial of the century and move back up here to the peninsula to 1931, where we have Elisha Kent Kane III put on trial in Warwick County. Now, Elisha Kent Kane, who is the gentleman we just saw in the last picture, was the son of a prominent doctor who was known for doing his own appendectomy. He had famous generals and explorers in his family, and in fact, his family was so prominent that the town in Pennsylvania where he came from was named for them, if you've been to Kent, Pennsylvania. He served active duty in the Army between 1917 and 1920. And in 1920, he was stationed right here on the peninsula and met a Hilton Village girl named Jenny. Now, Jenny Graham was from, again, Hilton Village. And they fell in love and had a very romantic relationship. But they spent some time apart while he traveled for both his service and for his new career after he moved to the reserves as a professor of poetry and romantic languages. They had this passionate relationship, but her parents did not like him one bit. He wasn't exactly a man's man. Now, what they didn't know was Jenny had a hidden heart condition that her father-in-law, Dr. Kane, was treating her for. But this time apart led to situations in their marriage. And on a cruise one day, he met Betty Dahl. They always put the worst pictures of these women, don't they? And she was a young divorcee working on a cruise ship, and they entered a very clandestine, brief affair. Now, Jenny discovered this affair after coming across letters from Betty and demanded that her husband end this affair. Now, he took a professorship in Tennessee just to be able to stay home and be with his wife and prove to her that he would never make that mistake again. So they planned this trip to Newport News in 1931 to go and spend time with her family, who did not like him, and then they planned to go to Grandview Island Beach. Now, Jenny allegedly gave her mother a letter that she intercepted from Betty to her husband that read, "With a little nerve and a very little time, we could get rid of her." On September 11th, 1931, they decided to go out to Grandview Island Beach, where we used to have that wonderful lighthouse, and it's extremely remote, still to this day. Now, she had recently expressed to her father-in-law she was scared that her medication was not helping her heart. She said it just wasn't working, her heart was fluttering and she would feel it stop on occasion. They went out to the Back River Lighthouse, again, very remote location, and the pair planned to go swimming. And Jenny expressed to her husband, "I'm a little concerned about my heart," and he's like, "I'm a strong swimmer, you will be fine." Now, while they were out there that day, some fishermen off the coast were hearing screams from the lighthouse, but they figured it was young couples probably doing what young couples do in a remote location, and they let it go. But not terribly long after that, Alicia was seen racing and screeching to a halt into Dixie Hospital in Hampton, and he carried the limp body of his wife inside. The doctors attempted to do all they could to resuscitate her, but they weren't successful. Alicia was begging for a different doctor to come and help his wife, and everything that they did was to no avail. She was dead. And this is actually her death certificate. Coroner Slice spoke to Alicia and ruled it an accidental drowning based on Jenny's heart condition. Now, Jenny's mother was not able to accept the fact that her daughter died of a heart moment in an accident, and she went to the coroner and allegedly gave this aforementioned letter from Betty to him, who then changed his opinion of what happened to her from accidental drowning to undetermined, but he never officially put it on record. Now, Alicia planned to go back to Tennessee after they had this funeral for her. They went and stood in St. John's courtyard with this beautiful little headstone where he etched a saying in Latin that basically said, "I will always have you in my heart." But as soon as the funeral ended, the police came and arrested Alicia for the murder of his wife. Now, the Grahams did everything they could to disparage him in the media. They claimed he was psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually abusive towards Jenny. And the Canes, but in the meantime, the Canes, Alicia's family, came to Hampton to visit him while he was in jail. He was known to always be very well put together, but he definitely wasn't well in jail. Now, the Kane family name was tarnished because of these accusations. And when they posted bail for Alicia, they went on a very ardent defense in the newspapers. So the public opinion of him started transforming from this cold-blooded wife killer to this tragic widower who had made a misstep, but having an unofficial hall pass did not equate him to a murderer. He was interviewed by one young woman reporter from Missouri who asked him, "Are you scared of the possibility of being executed?" And he said, "Physical death is not so terrible to me as life without the things I have lived for. Even if I escape the electric chair, my position as it is gone. My family disgraced, my wife dead." And he trailed off. Now, when the day came for trial, people were pouring in. Had this handsome young man and this grisly, juicy story. Now, Mrs. Graham would often fall apart in these fits of dramatic tears, having to be removed several times and put on bed rest for her misery. Now, her daughter-in-law, Jenny's sister-in-law, painted this picture of the Canes' life as one filled with profanity, booze, during Prohibition, of course, and how he allegedly bragged about his exploits with other women in front of his wife. But also at the same trial, friends of the couple, colleagues, and other family members came to the defense of Alicia's character, that he was devoted to his marriage, and a cheater doesn't make a murderer. On December 12, 1931, it was time for the jury to deliberate. By this point, crowds were spilling over into the streets, waiting to hear what would happen. They waited with bated breath, and at 11:45 p.m., the verdict was read. Not guilty. And this is actually a scene of Alicia, who's right in the middle there, leaving the courthouse. On the courthouse steps that night, he thanked his lawyer, thanked the judge, and said he wanted to go back to his quiet life. And, you know, after leaving the courthouse that day, his life did not return to normal. In fact, it was anything but. Now, the lives of the Canes, the Grahams, and of course Betty Dahl never intersected again, as far as I could tell in research. Alicia returned home to his family home in Pennsylvania, and he briefly managed the Summit Hospital after his father's death. In fact, upon his father's death, he gave his father's home to be a mental institution for the area. In 1933, he remarried a woman named Mina Gladys Schuler, and the two had two children together, and he returned to active duty service in 1941. He went on to earn the rank of colonel and was a Bronze Star recipient. But the center of this entire story is Jenny Graham Kane. Her grave remains a lonely relic in the back of St. John's Cemetery. No family around her, no one coming to visit and leave flowers for her, near a moss-covered wall, forgotten. And the last story we're going to talk about is one that not a lot of people realize that we, even up here in York County, are involved in, and that is the tragedy of the Lindbergh baby in 1932. Now what we have here is we have the crown king of aviation for that period, Charles Lindbergh, and his beautiful wife, Anne. And she was a gifted writer. She was a wonderful person, extremely intelligent, and a very decorated aviatrix. After they married and they had their son, Charles Lindbergh Jr., who was born on June 22nd, 1930. He had this curly blonde hair, a little dimple in his chin, and even these little kind of misshapen toes on his feet. Now, the couple was in their brand new home in Hopewell, New Jersey, when on the evening of March 1st, 1932, the baby's nurse came racing downstairs in a panic. Charlie was not in his bed. They went to his room and they found a ransom note saying, "We've taken your child, we want money." So of course this was a huge celebrity issue that was taken to the newspapers. And one intermediary stepped in and met with a man named Cemetery John in a cemetery in New York. He had a thick European accent, and they gave him money that was marked. Now, the Lindberghs were reluctant to trust the local police, and Charles decided to lead the investigation to find his son himself. And there's Charlie, and that's their home with the handmade ladder that was used. Now, Anne diligently every day printed a special diet in the newspaper detailing what her son would need, hoping the kidnappers would have some empathy and at least take care of her child until they could have him back. Now, seemingly separated from Hopewell, New Jersey, and the panic and tragedy that was going on up there was John Hughes Curtis Sr., a 45-year-old businessman from Norfolk. He owned the J.H. Curtis Boat and Engine Corporation. However, during this time period, his family fell on hard times. On March 10th, he contacted Reverend Dobson Peacock, and you see both the men. Reverend Dobson Peacock will be on your left, and Mr. Curtis will be on your right. And he confessed to being approached by this unknown bootlegger in the lot of his terminal. Now, this wasn't an unusual thing because these terminals at that time tended to have everyone from the most prestigious, the most unsavory of characters. But this man claimed that he was in touch with the kidnappers of baby Lindbergh and wanted John Curtis to be the intermediary. Now, Curtis never met the Lindberghs, never knew them or anything, just knew them from the newspaper. And Curtis was wrestling whether or not he should help and what to do. Reverend Dobson Peacock said to him, "You have no choice. To refuse would be inhumane." Now, several twists of fate later, and it led John Curtis to be standing right across from Charles Lindbergh himself in the office of his Hopewell, New Jersey home. Now, he had told this elaborate story about how he went to these train terminals, met with these people with these European accents, and Charles clung onto everything he said, failing to recognize that all these details have been published in newspapers. He told Mr. and Mrs. Lindbergh that the motive was to extort money from them, which is something they suspected. But Charles Lindbergh was holding on to every ounce of hope he could find, and he let Curtis take him on a wild goose chase, first to the New Jersey shore, where he claimed to give ransom money to the kidnappers on behalf of Charles Lindbergh. And then he said they never showed up because they were scared of all the media presence. So he said he was given instructions to bring the aviator out on a boat off the coast of nowhere other than here, York County. Now, Anne had quiet doubts. She stayed with her parents in New York City, but she couldn't help but wonder why her husband was placing this blind trust in this man. She continued to publish this diet every day while helping the case where she could from New York. In the meantime, Curtis brought Lindbergh right down to the Tidewater area. They boarded a yacht called the Marken that was owned by Colonel Charles Consalvos, terrible at pronouncing things, who was the owner of the Monticello Hotel. Depends on who you speak to, how that's pronounced. They sailed in and out of storms here in the York River, and they spent several days looking for this unknown sloop that was supposed to meet them. But the press was constantly hounding them, and Curtis said, you know what? The kidnappers must have been spooked. You know, they gave me instructions. We need to go back up to New Jersey. So they arrived in New Jersey with new instructions, and they waited to go meet this unknown boat. But Charles was never allowed to come along. On May 12, 1932, William Allen and Orville Wilson, who you see in this picture, went out. They pulled their truck over and went out to the woods to relieve themselves. One of them looked down on the ground and saw something shiny and dug at it. There were curly wisps of blonde hair. There was the dried, desiccated remains of a tiny child with curled toes and a dimpled chin. They raced to find the closest police officer and brought them back, who uncovered the remains of this child. They took a little bit of the clothing off and took a sample of it to the nurse, Betty Gow, I believe her name was, who identified it as belonging to little Charlie Lindbergh. He was dead. In the meantime, Charles Lindbergh was contacted to come back home. They didn't tell him why. Curtis was frantic. What did they find? Why is he leaving? We've got to go find the kidnappers. That night, Charles Lindbergh went to the morgue and was forced to identify his own child. He fainted and collapsed and was forced to leave until he returned the next day. Everyone involved with the case, including John Curtis, was held at the estate of the Lindberghs, but not told why, not told what happened, completely cut off from everyone. And the next day, Charles Lindbergh took the remains of his son in a pine box on a final drive to a crematorium. Now, John Curtis's story fell apart during the investigation. The police took him on to these places he once described in such vibrant detail, but all of a sudden couldn't figure out where they were. In the early hours of May 17, 1932, he confessed it was all a lie, said it was the product of a deranged man. And that's a piece of his confession. He was held in jail and put on trial in July 1932 in what was dubbed the hoax trial. He was convicted, fined $1,000, and he was released from prison that November. He returned to Norfolk, and he tried to put this case behind him. In fact, he denied a request to appear at the trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, who was later convicted and executed for the murder of Charles Lindbergh, Jr. And his neighbors and friends and family accepted that his tall tales were deemed the product of a deranged mind, where he was under stress for helping support his family. And he became the president of Dunn's Marine Railway. In the mid-1950s, he signed a contract to build the reconstructions of the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, and this is where all of our stories come full circle, for the Jamestown settlement. And in a newspaper, he said, and I think this quote clearly defines some highlights of his life, "Nobody but me would be darn fool enough to try it." He died on May 21st, 1962, and is buried in Portsmouth. Now, these were real people with real lives, and these were true tragedies, not just these kind of proverbial car wrecks we stop to stare at the side of the road. these victims left legacies. And it's our duty to make sure their voices don't stop being heard and their stories don't stop being told, and that we learn from them. And I like to think that communities are a lot like a human life. It may seem beautiful and opulent on the surface, but there are flaws and faults and traumas and tragedies behind it all. And it's in these darker times that you grow stronger as a community. And it's what bonds you together. And we are absolutely, again, no exception to that. And this is actually the grave of a young girl who was killed by an African-American boy who was lynched in the late 19th century. But again, we learn, we grow, and we continue to have this beautiful community spirit that we have here in the Tidewater of neighbor next to neighbor helping each other. And these are last shameless plug, I promise. And thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you for a very informative and entertaining presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll now throw it open for questions. If you can't hear me? It is. It says it's on.
You want to talk into my mic?
How about that? I don't need to repeat what I just said, do I? No. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. So because even though you may have a booming voice that we all can hear, for the video recording, we need to make sure we get it. So, any questions?
That last gravestone, the young girl, do you know that story? Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, it's a really tragic story. So in the Kempsville section of Virginia Beach, which is actually where I grew up, it was a farm, and this man hired African-American people to come and help out on the farm. And of course, there wasn't that kind treatment. So this one little boy, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Cherry. Well, he was a teenager at the time. And he had had a horrible life. Both his father and his grandfather were killed or executed for accused murders in North Carolina, that it's debatable whether or not they ever occurred. And then he lived in a world in the late 19th century here in southeastern Virginia where African-American people were treated horrifically. So he was fired by this farmer. And he being a teenage boy and having to endure all of this in his life, he basically decided he was going to get revenge, and he killed this farmer's 10-year-old daughter. Where that was tragic enough after discovering her remains. When he was taken to court, before he could even go and stand trial, the residents of Kempsville broke into the jail, removed him from it, and lynched him, hung him from a tree, let his body dangle, before he was even afforded a trial by jury, when he was still innocent until proven guilty. And it's the part of the story that's not really talked about, unfortunately. It was horrible and tragic, and he, in the end, was a victim of society, and this young girl was a victim because of that. And they basically told the people who lynched him, which there were several people there, including a United Methodist minister, that they were just going to get a slap on the wrist for murdering this young man before he could go to trial. So it's a horrible and tragic story. It's probably the hardest one it was to write for the book.
Any other questions?
I think she has a follow-up to
Got
that.
another one?
You know what I was wondering about? Trial would have been good just to make sure that he actually did it, you know?
Exactly.
Because so many times things happen and you find out someone else did it.
Exactly, and they took him out to the tree and they told him to confess, confess, confess. And so of course he thought that that was going to be the difference between whether or not they were going to kill him or whether or not he could go back to jail, so he confessed. They found little pieces of evidence, like they found her school books and things, but they didn't have that trial that was needed. Yeah. And they just kind of blew it off.
A follow-up to the last story, was the gentleman Curtis, you
Yes.
said, that was trying to help Lindbergh with the kidnappers. Was his motive to try and get money out of Lindbergh, or was he just wanting to associate himself with a famous case?
I think it was the latter more than anything else, because he didn't want or ask or try to get any money out of it, other than a little bit that he had taken to cover expenses, I guess you could say. But I think the big thing is he wanted money for publicity of being involved in it. Like, he met with a newspaper reporter in New York City when he was allegedly going to talk to the kidnappers, and he said he would grant the rights to his story for a certain dollar amount that would probably end up covering his expenses to take care of his family in exchange for, of course, the money. So I think a lot of it was the publicity and being associated with this very famous and beloved figure in our history, other than just to extort money directly from him. And after that, he didn't ripple any waves after that. And it was like it never happened. So, thank you.
Can you give us just a little preview of Lost Attractions?
Yes, Lost Attractions is looking at all the different things that used to exist around the Tidewater area, from the amusement parks like Buckrow and Ocean View to the Jamestown Exposition, which was our only World's Fair, and also looking at things like Rice's Fossil Pit, or one from my childhood, Coleman's Winter Wonderland in Portsmouth, and examining all these wonderful things. And there's a little snippet about Nick's Seafood Pavilion that used to be right up the road here. And asking the question, if these things are lost, meaning they're no longer where they are and we can't literally go to them anymore, are they ever truly lost? And how they create this beautiful framework of the boom of the Tidewater population. And also looking at some of the things we have around here today that we can still kind of look for and build new memories going to. So lots and lots of pictures in it. I think there are, my husband can remember better than I can, 100 some odd pictures in there? Yeah. Of all these different places. And I actually have a piece from Skyrocket roller coaster from Ocean View out in the lobby, if you want to see that. But again, it's looking at all these wonderful memories and places and really kind of being nostalgic. So thank you. And then I have another one coming out next year, which is basically me crawling through abandoned properties, taking pictures of them, and talking about their history and whatnot. So.
Any more questions?
Surprised my daughter doesn't have one. Oh, she's sticking her hand up.
It's because he's not letting me. Still, I actually
Okay, you have to wait for the microphone. Wait for Mr. Bob to come with the microphone.
Here we go.
My daughter always asks the best questions in Richmond. She asked me questions about why Charlie Lindbergh's remains looked the way they did when they were found. That puts me on blast.
So why is it that in the past and still now, like, Caucasian men are treated like better than anyone else? Like, even in the past, like, it's more relevant in the past than now.
She's
but
11 and
still.
a half years old. It's a very, very, very complicated and unfortunate situation. We'll talk about it later.
That's a whole nother subject.
And let me get your slide up here.
All three of the books you see up there are available for sale and signing by the author right outside as soon as we're done. I'd like to mention our next lecture will be held on October the 6th. The title, as you see here, is Founding Feuds. It's a different take on it there. The rivalries, clashes, and conflicts that forged a nation. Mr. Paul Aaron from Colonial Williamsburg is giving this one. I've seen it, and I think you'll find it to be very entertaining. So it's October the 6th, so we hope to see you there. And I also would like to mention, I'd like to invite you to, not today because it's closed for the next 2 weeks for some upgrades, but to visit at your first opportunity the York County Historical Museum, which is located in the basement of this building. It's really one of Yorktown's hidden gems with the amount of information and artifacts and so forth that are there, and that's in the basement of this building, the York County Historical Museum. And I think that's got it. Thank you very much for coming.
And thank you.